So in this video we're going to talk about changing the chain rings on your crankset from over, removing and installing new ones. In my case I've got a new set of cranks and I'm swapping the old chain rings, which are these SRAM ones, over to my existing Shimano Ortegra. But that's not really important. This video will apply to pretty much all Shimano chain rings in recent times. Now the chainring bolts which you need to undo, the bolt heads are 6mm hexes, which means you need a 6mm Allen key, hex key, to undo them. That's the basic tool you need for this job. A small handheld one like you see me using here is fine. It'll do the job. One with a little bit longer arm would be preferable. So once you've loosened them, you can just put a finger on the other side, on the nut, to hold it still while you undo it and remove the bolt itself completely. And I'll just, we'll have a look at how these actually work now that I've taken this one off. So there is a nut which goes on the inside, and it has a sleeve attached to it which penetrates through the crank body, and that sleeve, the inside of that, is threaded and the bolt goes into that thread. So the nut and its head sandwich the crank body essentially. Now if you have trouble removing them, which is quite likely, a bit of CRC, WD-40, some sort of penetrating oil, spray it on there. Do both sides. Make sure you're spraying it at the thread, not the outside of the nut sleeve, because that's not what needs to be loosened. Leave it for a few minutes to soak in there and then give it another crack. And this is why I said before it's preferable to have a longer arm Allen key than the one you see here. So if all else fails, there's always the amateur resort to greater leverage. Just a note of warning, be very careful when you're applying force on these things, because if you slip, impaling your hand or wrist on the tooth of the chainring is no fun whatsoever. And if the nut itself is a little bit seized, then you can just poke it with something, give it a bit of a tap, it should just pop out. And the final thing to look at with regard to removal of the chainring bolts, the nut in my experience will typically stick to the chainring, and you can just undo the head. You can loosen it sufficiently, and then you can just hold the nut with your fingers to remove the, to unscrew the bolt. If the nut, however, turns as you turn the bolt head, which of course is perfectly logical, then you need to hold it still, and Shimano have a special tool for that, because it's this proprietary thing with the two slots on either side, as you can see. But just something like a thin knife is perfectly adequate to do the job for you. You just need to work out a way of holding it on there with enough force to allow you to turn the bolt as you do it. And again, once the bolt is cracked loose, then you can just hold the nut with your finger and undo it the rest of the way. And once you undo the last bolt, obviously everything will fall loose. Pull everything apart carefully. Remember, the chain rings are hard, anodized aluminium or possibly steel, depending on what you're using. So they will scratch the aluminium of the crank, so be careful with that. If you have bits seized together, as I apparently do, and again, just give it a tap until it comes apart. You can clean chain rings down, use some degreaser or something if you like. My shortcut is to put them through the dishwasher. So at this point you'll have either two new clean chain rings or two new chain rings that you're putting on your old crank. Now when we install the new chain rings, in both cases we need to be concerned about both orientation, inwards versus outwards, and the angle in chain terms, that's called timing. For the large or outside chain ring, the first thing to look at is this cylindrical attachment. This is the chain stop, which stops the chain from falling down and getting jammed between the crank arm and the chain ring if it comes off the chain ring. So it obviously faces outward, and it needs to align with the crank arm. The other confirmation you have for outward versus inward is that the bolt holes are recessed to allow the bolt heads to sit flush. And generally the debossed writing will be such that it faces outward. So this is our correct orientation for the outside large chainring. And with the inner chainring, it's basically the same story. The countersink for the nuts will go in the correct orientation such that the nuts fit into them so that they're flush. And if the chainring has a timing mark, it will be a triangle or a diamond or something like that, and that's to be aligned with the crank arm. Now, when assembling everything, I'm going to use some Antiseize. This is a nickel-based Antiseize. The standard stuff to use is copper-based, so that would be fine. You'll notice before that I had trouble loosening my bolts and also that the chain rings were sticking to the crank arms. So it's a good idea to use Antiseize. It'll prevent those sorts of problems in the future, and it'll also slow down corrosion. So I'm going to apply it to pretty much all of the metal contact areas between the chainring surfaces and the crank body, and also the bolts and the nuts, particularly the threads. The other thing this will put a stop to, by the way, is creaking. If you get those sorts of annoying noises, creaks coming from your bike that you can never quite track down, this is one possible source of them. So once the Antiseize is applied, we go ahead and actually assemble everything together. You sort of need 3 hands to do this. You can make do with 2 if you're careful, as shown. Once you've got the first bolt and nut in place, just double check that the chain rings are correctly aligned and oriented before you proceed any further. Then go ahead and finger tighten all the rest. And then as you proceed to actually tighten them down, you should do it in a sort of star pattern. Don't just work your way around in a circle. At this point you could just wipe off excess Antiseize as it's squeezed out. You don't need to over tighten them. Remember, these nuts are just holding everything together. They're not actually taking any force or load when you're pedaling. And again, you may need to use your knife blade or the special tool if you have it to hold the nuts, but in my experience they bind sufficiently well when you're tightening them that they don't turn. And there you have it, chain rings on crankset. So I hope this was helpful. Good luck out there. Have fun.